My name is Whitney Sage. I'm a multidisciplinary artist originally from southeastern Michigan, specifically a suburb of Detroit called Farmington Hills. I'm honored to be here at Parkland College to talk a little bit about my work. I've got two different bodies of work that are represented here, both bodies of which are ongoing, so I'm actively adding to the works over the course of the last few years. Homesickness Series, the series that you see in the three sort of black-toned monochromatic works here, was a series that I began in 2016. And actually the very first piece from the series is this one in the lower right corner here. This was my very first foray into this style of working, as well as the material itself. Something kind of interesting about the series is that it started in a very different way for me than how I normally start a new series of work, in that I started with the material first. I purchased a bottle of Payne's Gray ink at an art supply store just because I thought it looked really beautiful on the shelf. And I'd never used acrylic ink before. It wasn't a material I'd actively used. I'd used similar materials, watercolor, pastel, gouache. So I've used similar materials before, but nothing of this nature. And so when I started producing this piece, it was more of sort of an experiment than something I thought of as being the starting point of something new. But I absolutely love the material. How it worked, how it looked, the subtle tonal color that's present within the gray, so much that I chose to kind of continue making work along this vein with this material. In terms of the work centers in both series about images of downtown Detroit, specifically the neighborhoods in downtown Detroit. It's a place that, being from Southeast Michigan in the suburbs, it was a place I was familiar with, not a place I was directly from though. And my interest in depicting the neighborhoods specifically is that it's one of the areas where the city has seen the most devastation over the course of the last 50 years. The city has started to rebound from economic turmoil produced by auto industry moving out from downtown Detroit, from suburban outmigration. There's a reinvestment that's happening in the city that's beginning to happen, but it hasn't really hit the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods too were so sprawling, Detroit being such a large city, that in a lot of ways it would require a massive influx of people in order to physically occupy the vast space that just exists in the city. And so in a city where actively a lot of buildings are being torn down, homes are being torn down, homeland is sort of disappearing, the point of the series, or the impulse behind the series, is to look at capturing in some means or another what used to exist, what's no longer there but once was, in a way that alludes to this history that may no longer be present. I have a lot of friends and family that are originally from the Detroit area, downtown specifically, and moved out. And something that struck me is when a lot of people talk about living in Detroit and their homes living in Detroit, in a lot of cases they're talking in the past tense, because it's not a place that they can physically go back to, because their home has been lost either through demolition, through arson, through a leveling and a rebuilding, even in some cases. And the idea of not being able to go home again, a literal inability to go home, really struck me. I can go back to all of my childhood homes regularly, and sure, they might look a little different. Somebody might have butchered the landscaping, or in one way or another made interesting paint color choices, but I can go back to that space and I can recall those memories that space locates. And for me, it was just really viscerally upsetting, the idea of going back to a place that was home and not being able to recognize what's in front of you. And so the work relates to that experience, that kind of melancholic experience of not being able to go home again, both as a metaphor for memory and loss in that departure from our home, but also as a direct correlation back to a literal inability to go home again with the disappearance of these markers of home and space. So for me, that's really where this impulse of this piece, this series began. It's entitled Homesickness Series because the series was produced when I was living away from Detroit. I was living in Columbus, Ohio, actually, at the time that I was producing this piece. I haven't lived in the Detroit area for quite some time. Jobs have taken me from place to place around the Midwest. So I'm constantly revisiting a place that's really meaningful through a physical distance. And so for me, one of the things that spurned on this series was a physical, personal homesickness. I also like, though, the idea that the name itself, homesickness, relates to a larger epidemic happening in the city of Detroit of these cities, or these houses that are being demolished on mass scale and being lost, in one day at a time. So I liked the idea of that kind of double-sided of the name. In the production of these works, I'm working with a lot of archival material. I am both physically occupying the space, photographing and documenting lots, going street by street in Detroit, but I'm also relying on resources provided by online archives of historic images provided by the Detroit Public Library has a great archive, as well as Wayne State University. There's these wonderful treasure troves of images of the neighborhoods of what used to be in different sites. So in some cases, I'm relying upon historic images to recall what used to occupy a space that no longer has any sort of remnants or clues to that. So Portraits of Home is a series that actually came out of the series, Homesickness Series, which you're seeing on the left. The series came about for a few reasons. First of all, after producing this piece, Family Room, as part of Homesickness Series, I really enjoyed the oval form, the oval shape of that image, and the way it recalled traditions of portraiture. It reminded me of historic images I'd seen of my own relatives in those old sort of tin-type photographs. So I really liked that evocation of almost a portrait, and how homes, in a way, and the facade of a home could be seen as a form of portraiture, a portrait that captures a life and a community that occupies those spaces. So for me, the series sort of came out of this idea of wanting to create a series of portraits, but portraits in a non-traditional way, in terms of not relying upon a figure for a portrait, but relying on a facade of a home as a means of representation of a person or of a community. For the material, it's the same material. It's the acrylic ink wash, but this time on panel. I painted these on panel for a few reasons. First of all, I plan for the scale of this series to grow sort of pretty infinitely. My hope is that the series can begin to become more emblematic of the scale of the problem of the loss of homes in Detroit. There's over 100,000 abandoned structures in the city of Detroit, many that are beyond saving and are just awaiting demolition. And so the idea of how many have been lost, how many will be lost to destruction and redevelopment. The idea is I want to create a series that really evocatively, through scale, reproduces that same sort of scale within the body of the work itself. It is the same material, but I've addressed color, or I guess come to color in a different way. I've started to introduce monochromatic color, but fixating on pinks and greens and purples and browns. This was actually the very first work that I've produced of all of them that are displayed here, although the series is larger than what you're seeing here. and it's already expanding. The series is up to 20 works right now. The color in terms of that work was directly related to the old adage, seeing the world through like rose-tinted glasses, as a way of talking about memory, and how when we think about and when we talk about things that used to happen, we see them oftentimes in a more positive light than they were. So kind of relying on almost that literal sort of sense, I've created a color that's very rosy, as a way of thinking back to this home as a site of memory. But then as I expanded this series, I really wanted the series, each individual work, to remain that of an individual. When I look at these sites, what sort of sets these apart from each other is their size, is their location, is the way I've framed the site. But there's something about the color that makes them very monotonous in a way. It makes them all kind of the same. And so for this series, in thinking about creating portraits, I didn't want to represent families and stories as monoliths, as all the same. Everyone's personal history is different, and the histories of these homes is different. What happened in these homes, who lived in these homes, was different. So color and the modulation of color between each work was a really direct way that I could address the individuality of the histories and the memories that these spaces contained. Now the scale on a sort of more, on a more direct sort of note too, in a lot of ways, when I'm producing these works over on the left, the material requires a really painstaking process in order to kind of build the image up to such a high degree of finish. And so for me, when you're spending 40, 50 hours in the production of a work, it feels slow. It feels like you're getting through an idea really slowly. And going to a smaller scale allowed for me to produce on a much quicker level, in terms of being able to create what you're seeing here, each painting probably taking me comparatively maybe 4 or 5 hours each. And in the kind of idea of this expanding to such a large scale, that was a really practical decision I had to make, is how physically am I going to be able to get this body of work to a scale and a somewhat reasonable timeline, if I'm needing 40, 50 hours to kind of document. So for me, the scale was a practical consideration, but something that's sort of nice that's come out of that is I didn't really expect how wonderful the smallness of them are, how personally engaging they are, how delicate and small, and how you have sort of a one-to-one, very small personal relationship when you interact with them. There's something that's kind of nice about something that's small and detailed compared to the scale of something large. It's quiet, it's understated, and that was something I didn't really expect out of how the work scale would sort of impact the message. So I really like that kind of smallness, the fact you have to get close to the works, you really have to look at them and think of them on a very sort of personal kind of scale. You have to physically get close to them. And that was something I didn't expect, but something that I'm really enjoying that's happened within the work. So I'm really excited to see where the series takes me. It's going to be something that I'm going to be expanding, obviously, over the course of the next few years. So I'm excited to see what sort of unfolds from that. There's been a lot of experimentation I've been going through as I've been working on this series. And so I've been making subtle changes to how I'm approaching the subject in each of the works. Which areas I leave absent, how I'm working with negative space, which areas I'm including, how I frame the house, what other sites sort of hints, whether it's little sort of remnants from in the interior of the home that I'm including. So I've been making subtle changes with each work that I've been doing as a means of trying to figure out what all these changes can mean, and how these changes can say something different about the person who once occupied these spaces, or person or people who once occupied these spaces. So it's very much ongoing. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, but I'm really excited about it. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to display the works at this point, at the very beginning stages, and see where they go from there.